let's go ahead and get started. I think this is about probably right on target with the amount of registrants that we've had. So there could be a few more people coming in. So, but for now, let's just kick off the morning. So hello, everyone, and welcome. I know my camera isn't on, but my name is Erin Alsop, and I'm the second year director for the South Carolina Archival Association. We're going to just run through, the day, and really looking forward to, learning and conversing with you all. I'll pause here to let my colleague May introduce herself as well.
Hey, I'm May Howe. I am the first year director, and I will be here with Erin to help introduce all the panelists and to keep things going today. Would you mind moving to the next slide? Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, as for meeting information, during the presentation period, please stay muted with your video off. Questions or comments can be entered into the chat. After each speaker is introduced and then speaks, there will be a Q&A period. And during that time, you can unmute to comment and ask questions by speaking. This session will be recorded, and a disclaimer I think the disclaimer's already appeared, but the recording has already begun. If you decline to be recorded, Zoom will remove you from the session. So I think you should have gotten that as soon as you logged in.
Mm-hmm.
And we do, just as a side note, we have the text for all of these slides. It's not letting us upload them to the Zoom chat right now, but we will send all that out as PDFs during the break.
Okay, so we're gonna just read out a land acknowledgement statement on behalf of the SCAA. So the SCAA land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this virtual workshop is hosted in South Carolina, home to dozens of Native American tribal nations for thousands of years. While many of the original tribal nations no longer exist, the Catawba, PD, Chicora, Edisto, Santee, Yamasee, and Chicora-Waccamaw tribes are still present in South Carolina, as are the descendants of the Cherokee. For thousands of years before Europeans arrived in present-day South Carolina, the lands in which we currently reside have always been occupied by Native Americans. Today, the many places in our state that bear the names of our Native ancestors attest to the important role Native Americans play in South Carolina's history. A land acknowledgement is a critical step for the South Carolina Archives Association towards working with Indigenous communities to secure meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. As an organization, we will continue our work to honor and acknowledge the Native inhabitants of this beautiful land and provide a safe space to listen to the wisdom and resolve of our ancestors. Let's take a moment of silence to honor those ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. Thank you.
Okay, so for today, we are going to start out with our welcome, which will include this agenda, what we've already done, introducing ourselves, and the land acknowledgement statement. And then before each presenter, Erin and I will take turns introducing the speaker. First up, we have Erica Veale, who's a processing archivist at Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture at the College of Charleston. And her presentation will be on documenting the ARC, the Low Country civil rights in the era of Black Lives Matter. And that will be about 40 minutes. And then she will give a presentation, which will be followed by a Q&A, and then we'll take a 10-minute break. And then for the next presentation, it will be by the South Carolina Library. There are 4 different speakers. Their presentation is called All Things Work Together for Access, Archival Advocacy at the South Carolina Library. And that will include Graham Duncan, who is the head of collections and curator of manuscripts, Edward Blessing, who's the head of user services and curator of published materials, Brian Cuthral, who's the manuscripts cataloger, and Craig Keeney, who's the cataloging librarian. And then that will be followed by a 10-minute break. Then there will be another session that is hosted by Megilliard, who's an archaeologist for Heritage Trust, which is a branch of South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. And her project is entitled While I Breathe, I Hope, the South Carolina Archaeological Archive Flood Recovery Project in the years since. And then Erin will give her closing remarks and we will conclude our workshop.
Awesome. So I'll go ahead and introduce Erica, our first panelist of the day. So Miss Erica Veale is here, as you see by her lovely headshot photo there. Erica is the project archivist and interpretation specialist at the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture, where she currently works on the center's Documenting the Ark Oral History Project, which was awarded $100,000 from the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation's new Broadening Narratives Grant. Erica is a certified interpretive guide, certified interpretive trainer, and formerly a certified master naturalist and master naturalist instructor. I'm curious to hear more about that, Erica. Erica received her master's in history with a concentration in African American history in 2013 from the College of Charleston, where she published a thesis on activist educator James Eber Campbell. So Erica, welcome. Just give me one moment. I will change the slides here just so I can bring up your PowerPoint. And let's see what we got. Give me 1 minute. Sorry, everyone. Slideshow. Okay, Erica, you're all set.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. So I guess I'll give you a little bit more background on myself. So I've been in Charleston since 2007, and I came to Charleston to study African American history at the college to work on my master's, and I was placed at the Avery as a graduate assistant. And it was a really beautiful experience. I worked at Avery for 3 years before I got my first full-time position with the county park system. So I was the cultural history interpreter out at Cuthral County Park. I was responsible for over 10,000 acres of park properties, all of which have different, historical significance. And during that time, that's when I became a master naturalist. So Master Naturalist is a really cool program that is hosted by Clemson, and I guess Cuthral was the center for that class. And so I went through that certification. It was a 6-month process. And because Cuthral also hosted it and I was an employee there, I then helped facilitate it after I was certified. So it really helped kind of round out my skills as an interpreter, because I had been interpreting the history of African Americans and Gullah Geechee history and culture in this historic building at Avery for 3 years. And then I went and started working in rice fields, started working, in swamps that had been hunting grounds for Indigenous Americans, and was able to learn how the landscape and the natural environment and the flora and fauna impacted the way humans, survived and thrived in this area. So that's kind of where the master naturalist side of things came. So, I know I can identify native plants and different things like that and kind of incorporate that into the way that I interpret history and culture. So thanks for asking about that. I'm very much a nature nerd. And you can, right now I still see my bio slide pulled up. So I don't know if you have the PowerPoint queued up.
Yes. Oh, hold on. Let me see. Sorry about that. I brought up, here we go. Zoom is not my friend this morning. All right. Is everything's where it needs to be, right?
Looks good. Yep.
Okay.
I don't have a whole lot of slides. So
okay.
I'm going to be talking about, so I came back to the Avery in 2019. I had been at the county parks for 7 years and took a little time off. And then my supervisor, who had trained me when I was a graduate student, retired and was like, you should get Erica my job. And so I was fortunate enough to be offered a full-time position at Avery in 2019. We had been closed down we had been closed to the public. The building had been for renovations for about 2 years. And so the staff had been working out of the library at the College of Charleston, because the Avery Research Center is a part of the College of Charleston library system now. And so So yeah, I came on as we were moving back into the building and transitioning all of our collections out of storage back into the building and into our new library and to our new archival storage. Now we have some of the most up-to-date, shelving in the city. And so that's kind of when I came back to Avery, and we were transitioning. We didn't have an executive director at the time. So about a year in is when we got our new executive director, Dr. Tamara Butler. And one of the first things that she did when she came on staff was say, hey, there's this grant opportunity, the Broadening Narratives grant. And so she talked to us about it at a staff meeting one day. And basically Broadening Narratives is a grant offered by the Donnelly Foundation, as Aaron mentioned earlier. And I'll just give you a description of it. So they're looking for diverse narratives that provide perspectives from the past, contribute to a better informed present, and lead to a more inclusive and sustainable and healthier future. And they encourage collecting organizations in the Lowcountry and in Chicago to amplify overlooked voices, animate and expand stories and insights derived from those collections. And those types of narratives that they're looking for are from culturally specific communities like African Americans, Indigenous peoples, other people of color, LGBTQIA+ perspectives, working class, and et cetera, et cetera. So we talked about that at a staff meeting. We set up a meeting to kind of go more in depth into it. And mind you, when I came back on staff, we had 2 graduate assistants working with us. One of them's name was Joshua Parks. So Joshua is from Jacksonville. He's an organizer, amazing high-level organizer, been to Cuba like 5 times. He went to Howard. And so he was working with us. I was training him. And he knew a little bit about me. So I also am an organizer. I started organizing in around 2014, August, around the time that the Ferguson uprisings were going on. I kind of got out into the streets in here in Charleston and trying to put in work. And like Aaron mentioned, I wrote my master's thesis on James Campbell. And James Campbell was an activist organizer, and he was a native of Charleston and went to the best Black schools here in Charleston. And he spent most of his career as an educator in Harlem, and he helped bring Black studies and multicultural studies to the forefront and establish them as academic disciplines at the K through 12 and the college level. And so I sat in on several oral histories with him because his collection is housed at Avery. So I got to meet him. And one of the things that I remember thinking was, when did we stop having this sense of social responsibility to take care of our people? Because it seemed like that was just part and parcel of his upbringing. You went to work, you went to church, you took care of your community. And so when things started going on in the community around 2014, that's when I really got inspired. I had just finished my master's thesis in 2013. So I was finally able to breathe. And so when things started going on, I got involved. And of course, we went through a lot of tragedies here in the Charleston area from the shooting of Walter Scott and then the church shooting a couple months later. So Joshua, who was a graduate student at Avery at the time when I came back as a full-timer, he kind of knew a little bit about my background. And one of my other coworkers, Darren, he was also involved. Both of us were lead organizers in Black Lives Matter Charleston. So Joshua, being a videographer and an organizer, he was like, I want to interview you guys. And I remember thinking, that's a lot of traumatic stuff. We went through a lot, during that time period. And I wasn't I wasn't excited to kind of relive some of that stuff because I was still dealing with some of the trauma that I had dealt with. And when I talked to Darren about it, he kind of expressed the same sentiment. So I remember kind of brushing Joshua off and kind of saying, well, do a little more research about what was going on in the time period, which he had already done. And that was kind of where we left the conversation. And so when it came time to sit down and talk about pursuing this Donnelly grant, that came back to my mind immediately. And so each one of our staff members kind of proposed a different project. And I just was like, well, what about documenting, Black Lives Matter Charleston organizers? Hold on 1 second, there's a truck backing up by my house.
It's
So
all
I said,
good.
I said, what about, documenting Black Lives Matter Charleston organizers? And everyone really liked the idea. So that's kind of where the project took off. So we started working on it and kind of just hit the ground running. You can go to the next slide now.
Sorry, just give me 1 second. It doesn't
worries.
want to. Oh, here we go. That's what I needed.
Thank you.
All right, no problem.
So the mission of the Avery Research Center is to collect and preserve and promote the unique history and culture of the African diaspora, with an emphasis on Charleston and the South Carolina Low Country and beyond. And we accomplish that primarily as an archival repository. We also have interpretive tours, thematic tours through our museum and our art galleries. And we promote lesser known stories about the Black experience. We have artifacts and manuscripts on display from our various holdings. We feature African-American artists and historians and enthusiasts in our various gallery spaces and things like that. So that's what Avery does. And we also kind of promote the idea of participatory archives, where we encourage communities that whose documents that we're archiving, so in this case, the Black community, to be consulted and have agency in how their narratives are preserved and documented and used. And so in terms of this grant project, we wanted that was really important to us. And so we proposed the establishment of, and by the way, we were funded, the project was funded. And so part of our proposal was to document those organizers and activists who responded to the calls to action, during the period in Charleston, from the Walter Scott shooting to the church massacre. So it's like a crazy summer that we had, but also, all the way up to the George Floyd protests in 2020. But our main emphasis is on that 2015 kind of spring and summer, right? And so in order to do that, we, in terms of the participatory archives, we established a community advisory board. So about 8 folks who were lead organizers in Black Lives Matter Charleston and LGBTQIA+ organizations like We Are Family Charleston. We met with some folks and said, hey, this is what we're planning. And if we get if we are awarded the funds, we would like, you to be a part of this board. And so we secured our folks. And then when we were awarded the funds, we started meeting every 2 weeks, and then we started meeting once a month. And we basically came up with a list of interviewees. We created a timeline using this free website called Time Toast, where we plotted out all the important kind of initiatives that were going on in our community. And there were quite a few. We went back to the Black Lives Matter Charleston Twitter and Facebook page from the very beginning and started, copying important events, flyers that were circulating, and we plugged all that stuff into the timeline. We had our graduate assistants searching for newspaper articles and scanning those and putting those in the timeline so that we could send that out to our interviewees to help refresh their memories about the different events that were going on that they had participated in during this time frame, for a lot of reasons, just because people forget, but also because of all the trauma that was kind of involved in that time period. It can affect the way that you recall things. And so the other aspect of it is that, in terms of our collecting scope, we are documenting social movements. And this isn't a new thing. Obviously, we have a lot of, we have a lot of civil rights collections at Avery and oral histories.
See, that's the, okay.
Sorry, Erica. Hey,
No worries.
folks who aren't presenting, can you please mute yourselves while we listen to Erica's presentation? Thank you.
So yeah, we have a lot of civil rights collections at Avery and oral histories from civil rights activists and organizers. But in the last 10 years or so, there's been a movement within the archival collection to be more proactive in collecting records rather than waiting for collections to be donated. And so that's kind of where this project took place. And you can go ahead to the next slide. So,
Good thing, just give me one.
no worries. That's a picture of the hospital worker strike. And then this is an image of the Walter Scott rally. And that's kind of where I got my start in Black Lives Matter Charleston, because I saw that rally on Facebook and I decided to go out. And that rally was, so Walter Scott was killed on April April 4th, 2015. And then the video that was taken by Faden Santana, whose interview we're actually going to be recording today at 1 o'clock as a part of our Documenting the Art project. He was walking to work to the barbershop that he worked at when he saw former Officer Michael Slager fire. Well, he was pursuing Walter Scott, and so he pulled out his camera and recorded it and ended up recording, Walter Scott's murder by Officer Scott, former Officer Scott. And so he had reached out to several organizers in the community, sent them like a screenshot of of the video to kind of show, hey, this is what I saw, and this is kind of contradicting the police statement that came out. And so that person in the picture there with the green shirt and the megaphone, that's Muhyiddin Dabaha. And he said, Faden said that he had sent that screenshot to several people, but Muhyiddin was the only person that responded. And so they then, over the course of, I think, just a couple hours, connected with Walter Scott's family, were able to get together to show them the video and figure out what the next steps were with the blessing of the family. And that rally in front of the North Charleston City Hall was the result. So that happened on April 8th, just 4 days after Walter Scott's murder. And I was in attendance there. And so in terms of our collecting scope, like I said, we're trying to be proactive in the records that we collect rather than waiting for folks to get old. Muhyiddin was killed in New Orleans on February 6, 2018. He was one of the lead organizers in the movement here in Charleston during that time. We've also lost other people to illness. Folks are struggling with substance use. So it's super important, for us to document these stories now. So in addition to convening the Community Advisory Board, which consists of lead organizers from Black Lives Matter Charleston and other organizations in the area during that time, the grant project has multiple parts. The video oral histories, like I said, today we're conducting a interview with Faden Santana at 1 p.m. And so those are, we have a videographer, we have our oral historian, Dr. Millicent Brown, who is amazing for a lot of reasons. And so we have our videographer, our oral historian, and we basically set up a studio in one of our seminar rooms in Avery. And so we said we're going to conduct 30 to 40 video oral histories, and then we're going to house those in partnership with the Low Country Digital Library using a platform called Avery. So that's where the videos will be housed, and then we'll have the transcripts housed at the Avery Research Center. So that's the one part of it. Then the other part of it is our community submissions portal. So obviously we can't interview everyone who was involved in the movement in Charleston during this target timeframe. So we've established, through the support of Cedar Wolf Media, a community submissions portal where folks can submit an interest form. And we're encouraging folks to submit poetry, protest signs, pictures, just anything, artwork that they created to support this movement. And so they submit the interest form, kind of an inventory of what they want to submit. And then our archival team will approve or potentially deny the submission. And assuming that we approve it, it will go into it will then be archived in the Documenting the Art collection. So those are the two approaches that we've kind of used in order to move this project forward. So since November, we've conducted 25 video oral histories, and we launched the submission portal in the spring, I think in January, and it hasn't got as many hits as we would have liked, but we've got a couple of really good interviews coming out with the where some local newspapers have interviewed us around the project. So we hope that gives us more interest, generates more interest in the community submission portal over the last couple months of the grant period. So just to give you a little more, I've got a couple of clips queued up, I think 4, they're about 30 seconds each, just so you can get an idea and a feel for some of the content of some of the interviews. So we can just go ahead and play the videos on the next 4 slides.
Okay, so you want me to just cycle through them?
Yep, that'd be great.
Sounds good, okay.
After I read the Sada Shakur book, it really opened my eyes to the issues that still exist, not even just within Charleston, but globally. It really, I feel like that was when my awakening happened. It like raised my consciousness to a different level. And I wanted to like be in more spaces like that to see how can we really make things really equitable and fair for everybody. Because like when I looked around, I looked at that and I really like analyzed what was going on. Like what are really the root causes of all, like, you know, we talk about food insecurity, we talk about poverty, we talk about the criminal justice system, you know, but what is really the root cause of that? After I read the Sada Shakur book, it really opened my eyes.
Sorry, I think that's the same one. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go.
This was the summer that a lot of people was calling the summer of death of Black people that we just start seeing over and over again. Young Black men were being killed by police over and over again. And when Mike Brown hit, it just blew up. You know, we saw Ferguson blow up, we saw Baltimore blow up, we saw plenty of places start to just really have these major demonstrations about the meaning of Black lives and the beginning of Black Lives Matter happening during the time. This was the
new generation. They're begging for participation. They've been begging for a year and a half for participation from what they call the elders. One of the most common questions that I get from them: where are the rest at? Where are the other elders? We got you. We know that if we got something going on, you will be there. Where are the rest of them at? The new.
If you're here 20 years from now and you have this longing to do something in the social justice vein, you're there for that purpose right now. And everything has come together. Whatever technology exists right now, everything that you're good at, that you have your hand to, you're supposed to be doing that.
Thank you. So those are just a handful of clips from the many interviews that we've done thus far, that we've conducted. And the first one was Akua Page, who is the lead organizer in Black Lives Matter Charleston. She co-founded Geechee Experience. She's a language activist who's done amazing work to promote Gullah Geechee language and culture, and connected with similar cultures throughout the African diaspora. And I met her at the Walter Scott rally on April 8th. And I've been able to see her grow over the last several years. She's been through a lot, and she's just grown so much in her activism. So it's been, and she's also a community advisory board member as well. So it's been wonderful to document her story and to work alongside her over the last few years. And then the second one was Darren Calhoun, who works at the Avery with me, who was also a GA, a graduate assistant, the same time that we went to the college around the same time, and we reconnected at the Walter Scott rally as well. And then the third interview was Pastor Thomas Dixon, who's been active especially in the North Charleston community and around the Walter Scott case, and very close colleagues with Faden Santana. And then the last one was Jason Gordine, who is a videographer who he recorded a lot of the protests that happened during that time and a lot of Muhyiddin Dabaha speeches. And Muhyiddin helped him establish the Black Collective. And he has all the rights to Muhyiddin's speeches, and he's going to be donating a lot of his protest footage to the Avery Research Center. So the beautiful thing about working at Avery is obviously my passion of history and interpreting the Black experience and archiving can all mesh together with my passion for organizing in the community and putting in work in the community, and they support all those various kind of passions. So this project has really brought all of those things together for me. And it's been a wonderful experience. It's been challenging, you know, coordinating interviews and encouraging folks to tell their stories, because a lot of folks feel like, oh, I didn't really do anything, or I'd rather save, you know, leave space for somebody else to tell their story. So just having to encourage folks to say, no, what you did was important, and make folks feel comfortable sharing and acknowledging that a lot of what we went through was traumatic. But just, you know, again, just encouraging, emphasizing the importance of getting these stories told now. It's been a learning experience, and this community submissions portal has been you know, a learning experience as well. If I had to do it again, I would probably budget for some honorariums to encourage folks to speak and to submit. But that's just, you know, hindsight. So yeah, you can go to the next slide, please. That's pretty much it. You know, we've got a couple more months to wrap this project up. And any questions?
I mean, I certainly have a few questions. Let me look at the chat here. Okay, no questions from the chat, but I did have a few questions for you, Erica.
Sure.
And for others on the call today, you know, if you want to jump in and add to the conversation, you know, we're very casual in that way. But so Erica, I really liked how you established what you call the community advisory board.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I think that's an important part of, you know, definitely an important part of establishing these sort of projects, because in my perspective, it establishes like this culture of care, right? And I guess to someone who is just starting out, trying to figure this out, you know, and implement these types of projects in my own community, what's some advice that you would have, at least with starting something like a community advisory board? Are there certain folks internally and externally that, you know, that should be included from the beginning? You know, I am a lone arranger, to kind of preface it in that way. So as much as we're trying to start an oral history program, it's hard to do with one person.
Right. Well, I mean, this was the first grant that I pursued, you know, as a full-time employee at Avery, and it was successful. So, and it was based on something that I know intimately, which was this particular organizing community. So for me, it only made sense to reach out to people who had been involved in the history and the events that we were trying to document. So that meant lead organizers, that meant organizers from fellow organizations in the LGBTQIA+ community, because again, we're trying to tell stories from these marginalized communities. So yeah, we reached out to folks, and I mean, in our case, everyone that we reached out to was amenable. You know, everyone we reached out to said, yeah, count me in. And so it just worked out.
Mm-hmm.
But it was important to engage them at the beginning, you know, before we even submitted. I don't even think we submitted a proposal when we convened that meeting with folks. So I think a lot of folks, in terms of Avery, we get asked to participate in grants all the time. Grants that are due tomorrow. We'll get a call today. Hey, we're putting your name on this, you know, and we turn stuff down all the time because folks want to check off boxes sometimes and say, okay, we've got buy-in from the African-American community, Avery supporting this. And it's not that way, right? You have to like give folks time to process, do things in a timely manner. And that's kind of what we did. We reached out to folks well ahead of time, gave folks the opportunity to talk to us about the project, to ask questions, and decide whether or not this was something that they wanted to do before we even thought about submitting, you know, a proposal to the Donnelly Foundation. And I think that was important because we wanted to make sure that we were getting a well-rounded, that if we had the opportunity that we're able to tell well-rounded stories from multiple perspectives. And it's not just organizers that we're interviewing, we're also interviewing artists, you know, educators, interpreters, and asking them how they, you know, those events that we're kind of talking about impacted what was going on in their lives, the work that they were doing, the art that they were creating, the teaching that they were doing. And so having that advisory board to kind of steer us in terms of who to reach out to. And, everybody knows, has a network that they were able to kind of reach into. That was really important. But like I said, for me, it was just a very natural kind of process because I was there. I knew who the people were. Darren, who's also on staff at Avery, was there. He knew he was even more plugged in than I was, in my opinion. And so it just kind of worked out naturally in that way. So I'm definitely not an expert on that. I just got lucky.
No, and it's it's a really inspiring, project. I know that the topics discussed can definitely be sensitive for a variety of reasons. So I really thank you for sharing the good and the bad with it all. And I guess from once the project or the grant ends, what are some post grant goals that you have? Like, do you kind of see this being incorporated, say, into instructional classes, like whether it's K through 12 or for college students, to access things like that?
That's a great question. So one of the things that we would like to do is edit the videos into a documentary, into a educational kind of video that could, and create some curriculum around that. So that would be, I think Donnelly actually offers another grant for those types of projects. So that would probably be on our radar after this grant period ends. And somebody asked in the chat if the interviews were open to the public. So right now we're still collecting them and getting them processed into our archive and getting the transcripts transcribed. And so eventually they will be available to the public via the Low Country Digital Library.
Oh, great. Thanks. There was another question that came in as well. Says, thank you for all this amazing work you're doing, Erica, on all fronts. Could you speak a little more about the types of physical materials you've had donated so far?
Well, I wish I could, but we haven't got too many submissions. So again, we're asking for images and posters. There's this one person in the community who he was at every protest and he had the coolest protest signs, like really cool stuff. And so I would love for that guy he seems like the type of person that would keep all of his protest signs. So I would love if we could get a couple of his signs, donated to the archives. There were a lot of poets who would come to the different protests and demonstrations. There was one at the Walter Scott rally, the first one that I attended, the first major one that I attended around local events, here in Charleston. So those are the types of folks that we want to submit. Like I said, Jason Gordine is planning to submit all of his protest footage. So right now, haven't got a lot of interest, but we're hoping that we get a big push in the last couple of months of the grant period.
And another question came in, Erica. It says, this is an outstanding project. Post-grant, is there anything that you would do to recalibrate the process for the community submission portal to get more buy-in and publicity?
Right. I would definitely have pushed that out sooner. We started in the way we laid it out in the grant timeline was to start with the oral history interviews, because I guess those in our minds took precedent. And then we pushed the community submission portal. As we began the interviews, we were also developing the portal. So the portal then launched a couple months later in the end of January. So I would have definitely launched that sooner. Lined up some of these media interviews, like we did an interview with the Charleston City Paper and the Post and Courier. Both of those should be dropping in May, but we're almost at the end of the grant period now. I would also have done the budget differently. Like I said, I think being able to offer honorariums to the interviewees and to folks submitting to the submission portal would have been a great idea. I've definitely thought about how we could have moved money around in order to be able to offer, $200 to $300 honorariums, I think. And that would have encouraged folks who were hesitant or who just maybe don't have the time to maybe prioritize getting those materials donated.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jim Cross from Special Collections at Clemson, and I was just wondering, since you had talked about network networking earlier,
Mhm.
have you talked to, the advisory boards and other people that you've worked with to see if they know some of the people who should be submitting to the portal, and maybe they could go and, poke the person and say, you really should submit to this.
Man, all we do is poke. All we do is poke. So we came up with a list of interviewees, about 40 people, and we've reached out to several. A lot of people haven't responded, or they've dragged their feet. Like I said, we've been able to get about 25 interviews, plus a couple of folks did part twos, because one of the things we noticed when you get in there, there's so much to cover. So we had a couple folks back for part two. So we've done about 28 interviews altogether, 25 with unique individuals. So we have that list. And then we had a list of community submission portal, other people that we know are super active, but may not make it into the video oral histories. And so all we do is poke people. All we do is poke people every week. Like I said, we started, the advisory board met bi-monthly, and then now we just meet once a month. And our next meeting, or I think this will be our last, is next Tuesday. So yeah, that's why I think that honorarium piece would have helped. It may not have, been the cure-all, but I think it would have encouraged a lot of folks who maybe are like, oh, I want to submit to that. Might have pushed them over the edge to actually get them to do it. So we shall see.
We had one more question come in regards to physical donations. The question is, are you attempting to archive any related social media? If so, how?
Social media is tricky, and it's not my area of expertise, but our archival manager at Avery, Aisha Heichel, spoke to this a lot, because it's come up in our advisory board meetings, because you have to get permission, because it's public, but you also have to get permission from everybody who participated kind of in the conversations. So in terms of like the Black Lives Matter Charleston Facebook and Twitter, the Black Lives Matter Charleston Facebook page had over like 10,000 followers on it. It was a very popular page. It was a great way to disseminate information about the movement, things that were going on in the community. And then we also had like the leadership had a private group chat on Facebook, and reaching out to folks to get their permission to archive. Some folks have deactivated their Facebooks and moved away. And so it's been kind of tricky. I think there's a lot of red tape kind of involved in documenting certain things on social media. So that hasn't really been the priority, but we did use that to help us with that timeline that we established. We used social media to pull a lot of information into a timeline that will then be archived. A lot of that, again, were graphics about, this protest, that protest, this community meeting, this community initiative. The Michael Slager trial starts, the Michael Slager trial ends, Faden Santana gives his testimony, all those things we pulled from the news, the media, social media accounts, community social media accounts, and kind of plug them into that. And that's kind of been the way that we were able to archive that. And that'll be a part of the Documenting the Art collection.
Awesome. I guess in more of like a technical question, with the interest form, what type of platform did you use? Was it a Google form, an Excel sheet, or was it something more created specifically, as part of the grant? Or
right. So I think it's just a Google sheet or like a plugin that was added to our Avery's website. So if you were on Avery's website and you go to the outreach tab, archival projects, and then documenting the ARC, and the next slide has that information on it if you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So yeah. And I actually, if you want, in this last 2 minutes, I'll drop the link in the chat, and you can share your screen and just kind of skim through the community submissions portal.
Okay. Let's see. Hold on, let me see which screen I'm sharing here. Okay. All right, can everyone see that?
Mm-hmm. So that's the portal, has a little background about the project, talks about the video oral histories, and then If you scroll down, there's the interest form. It's
Okay.
basically
this is
just a
awesome.
Google form.
Okay. Because that was my my larger question, like, do you have a toolkit of, tools and recommendations for smaller institutions or, those loan arranger type of institutions that, that want to get started. But this is really, really helpful, insightful. Okay, you have that here. This is great. This is really great. And on behalf of the South Carolina Archival Association, if there's anything that we could do to promote, what you're currently doing now, anything, post grant, moving forward to, we're happy to, put things on our website and really whatever you need in terms of, advocacy and outreach, we're happy to help.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for having me today. And thank you everyone for giving me your attention. What I think I'll do is just share our little social media toolkit with you after via email. And if you want to post that little graphic about the submission portal, that would be great.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Erica. This has been really, really wonderful.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm a little discombobulated here, May. Just give me 1 second.
Oh, that's okay. Next up is a break. So I was just
There we go.
break. All right.
So we'll have a break here and then, or what time is it now? So yeah, so we'll take about a 10-minute break, right?
Yep. Meet back at 2 o'clock.
All right, I'm gonna refresh my coffee. Hey, Graham, are you going to be sharing your slides?
Yeah.
Okay, I remember you did say that. I just wanted to double check.
Right, we got two different PowerPoints, so
No
we're gonna
problem.
we're gonna see how this goes. I'm
I
good.
think it'll be perfect. So want me to go ahead and
Presentation PowerPoints switch.
so I'll go ahead and stop sharing and then let you take over. How's that sound good?
Were y'all doing like an introduction or something?
Oh, yep.
Slides first.
Yep, you are correct. Sorry, my brain likes to
No
jump.
worries.
So this should be, what slide is this? Let's see here. So that's slide 8. So I think May will be doing these introductions.
Okay.
I'll wait until May gets back.
I am back. I have a quick question. Do you want us to do all of the introductions at the beginning and then all of the questions at the end, or do you want to treat them as separate segments?
Let's just do them all at the beginning and then at the end.
Okay, that's how we figured, but just wanted to check.
Yeah, I mean, they're in some ways kind of disparate little presentations, but I got the duty to kind of tie them all together. So
Yeah.
we're gonna try to kind of do them all
Yeah,
as one in some way. So yeah, I think that'll be
sounds good.
easiest.
Okay. So we're right at about 9:59. I'm going to say we could probably advance to the next slide there. And May, apologies just because I have the screen kind of enlarged at this point. Will you introduce all 4?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that sounds good. I just want to make sure I have my notes right.
Yep.
All right, so I'll go ahead and advance to the next slide.
Okay, so for our next presenters, we actually have 4 from the same institution, but they work in different branches of that institution. So they have a lot of different things to contribute. This will be a little bit different than the last one because they have many different projects going on, and they're not focusing their presentation on just one of those, to my knowledge. So first up, we have Graham Duncan, who is currently serving as the head of collections and curator of manuscripts at the South Carolina Library. In this role, accessioning, arrangement, description, and maintenance of manuscript collections, and helps coordinate collection development. I'm sorry, I was reading off the wrong one. Including outreach to relations with potential collection donors. A native of Travelers Rest, South Carolina, Graham holds a BA in history and a master's in library and information science from the University of South Carolina. He has been employed at the South Carolina Library in different capacities since 2002. And then we will have Edward Blessing, who is the curator of published materials and head of user services. Edward currently serves as head of user services and curator of published materials at the South Carolina Library. In this role, he oversees the reference and research use of collection materials and helps coordinate the collection development of the library's published materials. He holds a BA in English and a master's of library and information science from the University of South Carolina and has been employed at the South Carolina Library in a variety of roles since 2010. And then we have Brian Cuthral, who is a manuscripts cataloger. Brian catalogs manuscripts collections at the South Carolina Library and informally serves as an unofficial field archivist, always on the hunt for South Carolina publications and manuscripts. During the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year, he donated more than 100 books written by or about South Carolinians, as well as 49 serial titles representing 253 issues, and was reimbursed for an additional 89 works. Brian completed a master's degree in library and information science from the University of South Carolina and a Bachelor of Science in Geology from the College of William and Mary. Prior to moving to South Carolina, he worked for Colonial Williamsburg, volunteered at the Valentine Museum in Richmond, and helped dismantle several threatened historic buildings for relocation, one of which he merited a brief mention in the Washington Post. Although in recent years, he no longer pulls desk duty at the SCL reading room, This background enabled Brian to better communicate with the library's many researchers from fields of archaeology, museum, and historic preservations. And it continues to inform how he describes and catalogs collections. And finally, we will have Craig Keeney. Craig is a cataloging librarian at South Carolina Library. Craig describes continuing resources, manuscripts, monographs, sheet music, and sound recordings held by the South Carolina Library. He participates in the Cooperative Online Serials Conserve program and Name Authority Cooperative NACO program. He holds master's degrees in library and information science and public history from USC. Craig has also served as co-principal investigator on the South Carolina Digital Newspaper program funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and supported by the Library of Congress. All right, and at this point, I think Aaron's gonna give it over to Graham to share his screen.
Thanks. Yeah, let me get this going. All right, you'll see that?
Yes.
Good?
Yep.
Awesome. All right, yeah, so as May and Aaron said, we're going to be kind of presenting as a team today to kind of talk about how all of us in our different capacities as catalogers, those who work kind of behind the scenes in acquisitions and accessions, and those of us who work kind of front of the house on user services, all work together kind of for access to providing access to materials to patrons, particularly materials from historically underrepresented kind of groups. I'm just going to start with a brief kind of introduction to the Caroliniana for those that may not know kind of what it is. So the South Caroliniana Library is one of the 5 special collections repositories here at USC. It was officially established as the South Caroliniana Library in 1940, and with a mission to acquire, preserve, and make available South Carolina-related research materials of all kinds and from all periods. So how that manifests now is largely within 4 collecting areas. So we have a manuscript collection, a published materials collection, and a visual materials collection, and also the university archives. So the records of the university itself are held as part of the South Caroliniana Library. All of those are made accessible through a unified reading room, right now located in Thomas Cooper Library. As you know, most of you are going to be familiar with, we are a closed stack non-circulating library. So how we're going to go with this is I'm going to turn it over to Brian to talk about some of the work he's done both in acquisitions and describing materials to better reflect kind of the diversity of those materials and the variety of voices kind of represented by them. Craig's going to do a bit about a new cooperative metadata team that's been formed here at USC across collections. Edward will speak specifically as head of user services to kind of connecting our users with the collections themselves. And then I'll just kind of round it out with where we're going with collection development and donor relations a little bit. So with that, I'm now going to attempt to stop sharing this PowerPoint and share a completely different one to see if that works. All right, I got that one too.
Okay, can everyone hear me well enough there?
Yes, we hear you just fine.
Okay, great. So my name is Brian Cuthral. I'm manuscript cataloger at South Carolina Library. For our researchers, I provide context for the descriptions that I write up in code to OCLC so our computers can sort it and humans can find it. I love my job, learn fascinating stories every week. Our visitors represent many age groups and professions. Many of them have no connection to USC. And in recent years, more of our researchers have been accessing our collections remotely, so they may not have enjoyed the sage advice of my colleagues in the reading room in real time. So the descriptions in the catalog record are even more important. And Graham, can you do the full screen?
Is it not showing full screen?
It's I'm still seeing the sidebar.
It's just not in presenter mode.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had got into that.
It's okay. We all gotta
It's
have the space and
sneak-
grace.
Yes, sneak preview of coming attractions.
Is that working now?
That's good, thanks.
All right. Yeah, sorry about that.
So today we're talking about several ways you can enhance the diversity of your library's collections. Number one, with active collection development. Number two, locally, you can significantly enhance records that are copy cataloged into your system to fit your own mission statement. And three, you can describe newer legacy collections so as to recognize any racial, linguistic, sexual, or ethnic minorities represented. In terms of collection development, over the years, I've donated many memoirs, organizational histories, and other titles that are not held in any library and may otherwise might never have reached SCL through our usual channels. I've donated the usual sorts of books you'd expect us to hold, such as titles on South Carolina biography, industries, wars, local histories, as well as titles that document various subcultures and fandoms, such as graphic novels and comics. I've also found a lot of things on very serious topics, such as a friend who attended Walter Scott's funeral and arrived early enough to get a seat inside. He was glad to donate the program, so that's something that we have. I found memoirs written by people who have been homeless and others incarcerated, people who survived cancer, survived suicide, and people struggling with grief. Next slide. Great, okay. And next slide. So one strategy for collection development is usually free. That's analytics. I found many essays about South Carolina topics and people and magazines published elsewhere for which we do not have a subscription, such as something in the New Yorker or The Economist or alumni magazines. This allows us to see ourselves as others see us, and sometimes that's an eyeful. This is kind of collection development on micro level. I mean, I have certainly chatted up people and brought in a couple of larger collections, but it's just another way to kind of pull in biographical information, organizational histories that might not be available otherwise. These analytics often might come from publications that are unlikely to be scanned, indexed, or widely available online or long term, and maybe about topics for which no one's yet written a book. So in terms of, I'll be talking today about some of the African-American history, biography, organizations, churches, HBCUs, and high schools documented in my donations. Summer 2017 issue included, of this fraternity magazine, included profiles of 2 South Carolina men. And fair warning, some of the illustrations I'll be using today are not the actual item I donated. These are just a standard illustrations, and think of it as an avatar. And next slide. So learned about an expat South Carolinian in this issue of Sierra magazine from 2009. This is really interesting. This park ranger Shelton Johnson of Yosemite performs a first-person interpretation of Elise Bowman, a Buffalo soldier of the 9th U.S. Cavalry. He was born in Spartanburg. He served in Yosemite in 1903. Not a lot is known about Bowman's life, so Johnson can take some artistic license. Ranger Johnson has been portraying Bowman for more than 20 years. He has a podcast. He's published on the Buffalo Soldiers. He appeared in Ken Burns' documentary about the national parks and many other places. Next slide. This issue of Outside Magazine from May 2018 follows a similar theme about enjoyment of the outdoors. It includes a profile of Ms. Latria Graham. Her family moved to Dewberry County in 1997 when she was 10 years old. So this whole theme that this issue was about, kind of countering the stereotype that it's only young white guys who want to go camping and hiking. Next slide. So this alumni magazine included an essay by a young man from Columbia who was attending this prep school in Virginia, Woodbury Forest. It's kind of interesting. He's a child of privilege, but certainly he was probably only about 9th grade, 14, 15. So it was published because he was one of the winners of the spring 1997 speech contest, arguing for taking down the Confederate flag. Next slide. Not a magazine, but a book. This has a chapter devoted to another minority population in South Carolina. It's got a interviews with Rita and Dean Smith, who live on Pawleys Island. South Carolina would not be listed in the subject heading, but for us it is. Next slide. Interview projects are always interesting. This volume from Spelman in Atlanta has interviews with several women with South Carolina connections. Next slide. Next slide. South Carolina appears on following pages, and it's not very widely held. But again, this is another one of those things that we don't have the complete set. But if this tips someone off to this series, then they can hunt down the rest of it if it relates to their research. Next slide. I started collecting and donating local Spanish language publications to SCL years ago. So we don't have a complete run, but again, someone can go look for it. Next slide. And this is a bunch, you can see a lot of these started in the 1990s and early 2000s. Next slide. And next slide. This is holdings. We have a pretty good run, not complete. I fear a lot of these Spanish language newspapers probably died during COVID. We had even when we tried to contact them about getting complete runs, no one would return phone calls or emails. Even we had native speakers from native Spanish speakers contacting them. Next slide. This is the infamous Spanish language driver's manual that we always had a chuckle about. So it's been published for years and years in Spanish, and then someone, this is another artifact of the culture wars, some legislator got upset and had announced that, well, this is an outrage, this will not stand, we're not going to publish this in Spanish anymore. And so that afternoon I went at lunch and went to the DMV and grabbed one so we'd have one for our collection. Next slide. So many publications, I've found a lot of materials to document the history of religious denominations around South Carolina and African-American congregations. The pastor's anniversary is often celebrated in a big way. The programs printed out for the ceremony are more like a booklet, not a leaflet. They often include biographical information on the minister, first lady, some members of the congregation. So I donated one from 2014. This slide is from a more recent celebration of McKirkland's ministry. Another good source is for church histories are cookbooks. Usually there's going to be 3 or 4 pages in the front with the history of the congregation, talking about there might be pictures of their earlier buildings, that sort of thing. Next slide. This was another one that has good historical information on this congregation in North Columbia. Next slide. Found a lot of Jewish publications. This family had gone to Beth Shalom, but there were other newsletters as well. Next slide. And next slide. And can't forget the Catholics. This was kind of amazing that this was not held by any library. He completed this dissertation in Rome. But this is the kind of thing should have had a book deal written all over it. Next slide. So one thing, this is the idea of enhancing records when you copy catalog it into your system. If it doesn't say as much as you want for your researchers, the image on the left is how this book was described in 2010. And when we exported it into our own system, we added Craig added a 520, a summary field. You can also add a 545, a background field, and that other useful notes that will be of interest to your researchers. Because we are cataloging for South Carolina people, South Carolina themes, and so our records might be more detailed than what somebody sitting in Minnesota would do. Next slide. And let's see. Oh yeah, so when you're describing a new record or you're revisiting an old legacy collection, it's very different kind of for us at SCL versus rare books. They have celebrity authors like Shakespeare, Fitzgerald, and Hemingway, but many of the people who created SCL's collections are not well-known household names, but their insights are still of great interest to our researchers. When describing this kind of material, it's important to commit your due diligence to try and identify these creators when possible. Ancestry.com completely changed the game for us, as did all the digitized newspapers. Google Books, online version of the state, and the Crown of America site. These resources enable us to identify creators of many manuscript collections that we might have owned the collection for years and years, but we may never have known who the creator was. Next slide. If I do find a reference that someone's papers are located at one or more other libraries outside of South Carolina, outside of campus, I'll always include that 544 field. That's really useful to point people to where there might be more information, and there might be the next generation represented or the other half of the correspondence. When describing a manuscript collection that includes any wills or other estate papers, I always check for names of enslaved persons to include in the record. I also try to determine the birth names of any women who feature prominently in the collection in hopes of connecting these people and activities to other collections held by SCL or elsewhere. Beyond campus, the county, state, and federal levels around the country, many government records have been digitized and indexed to a far greater degree than in the past. We can now identify and make use of more of those needles and haystacks that enable us to know more about enslaved and free people of color who appear in runaway ads, petitions, wills, and other persons who have been harder to trace in past generations. More recently, during the past 25 years, there have been many anniversaries and celebrations marking milestones of the civil rights movement. Many publications, both national and local, ran interviews, historical sketches, and coverage of local celebrations and conferences. These more recent online newspapers have also been a great resource for our researchers. Next slide. When you're trying to research the life of someone who did not leave much of a paper trail, remember the jurisdictions often change a good bit over time, depending on where you live. The old 96th district in South Carolina was eventually carved into 8 counties and also touched portions of 4 other counties that we know today. Next slide. When describing a collection, we need to be sensitive to the idea that someone may have lived on the same farm for decades, but the name and boundaries for their crossroads, post office, parish, district, or county that appears on their legal documents may have changed a little bit over time, even if their address did not. Next slide. We often find amazing stories when we're on the job. And Craig Keeley was cataloging the library of James Ritchie Spartman. He ran across a set of sheet music that had been bound together with both handwritten and published scores arranged for voice and guitar. The sheet music volume had formerly belonged to Esther Ball, but we aren't certain of a connection to the Spartman family. Next slide. This volume includes the work Didst Thou Ever Think of Me, published between 1830 and 1850. It's an arrangement for guitar credited to a composer in Philadelphia identified as S.M. White. Craig did some more research and determined that S.M. White was an alias for Samuel L. White, an African-American musician and composer based in Philadelphia. Looking for more biographical information on White's career, Craig discovered that White eventually left Philadelphia for Louisville, Kentucky, where he founded the Mozart Society, a music appreciation society that gave concerts in African-American churches. This rare copy of Didst Thou Ever Think of Me is one of the few surviving examples of his work. Next slide, I've included the links that Craig had researched, including this great blog post that he did on working on that collection. Next slide. And finally, I'll finish with talking about some of the comics and graphic novels that we collected. I was surprised to find this 2002 interview with the son of a Charleston physician conducted by Dustin Emery Hostetler for his Arts magazine published in Toledo, Ohio. This interview with Shepard Fairey appeared in 2002, and it's a thick letter-sized art zine. And this was years and years before he became famous and more of a household word for his Obama Hope campaign posters. In South Carolina in particular, he was already well known for his stickers. Andre the Giant has a posse that were seen all over certain parts of Charleston and Columbia back in the day. Next slide. Here's a 1970s comic on the life of Robert Smalls. I accidentally bought an extra copy intended for SCL back before smartphones were smart, so I wasn't yet able to consult the USC library catalog back then. Next slide. So in 2019, when Rare Books opened their exhibited extensive comic book collection for Gary Lee Watson, SCL brought out for the first time our collection of SC comics dating as far back as the 40s, along with more titles that I've been donating over the previous 10 years. This is a comic that's by Shigeharu Kobayashi called Princess Calabrata. It's a Romeo and Juliet story about the warring kingdoms of Columbia and the kingdom of Casey, and how she falls in love with the prince from the rival kingdom. Next slide. Twisted Kaiju Theater by that Godzilla guy, Sean McGinnis, had been doing this for years and years, and he's got like 12 years or so of this comic, posing as action figures and voice bubbles online. Next slide. By far the most famous comic in our exhibit was Sanford Green. He began his career in comics in 2006. He's worked for both Marvel and DC Comics. And here we see Bitterroot, which he's become pretty well known for, and it's now going to be a movie. Next slide. Sanford Green is a native of Greeleyville, but he's lived in Columbia for many years now. Next slide. So we are in good company in collecting his works. And next slide.
All right. Thanks, Brian. I think we're going to hold all questions to the end just to,
Yes.
that'll be good. So excellent. All right. Let's see. Stop sharing this. Share this again. Let me see if I can figure out how to get back to.
I was going to say you had your slides up. It just wasn't in presenter mode.
Yeah, I was in presenter mode again, and I couldn't find the option to get to switch them again like I did.
I think if you oh, what was it? I think slideshow. Oh, there you are.
Yeah,
Is that not what you need?
it's still not in presenter mode, is it?
Well, I see your full slide. I don't see notes or anything like that. So it looks to me like it's in presenter mode.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, Edward said it looks good. So
All right. Well, then we'll just go from this then. All right, Craig.
Hey, can everyone hear me?
yes, here, just fine, Craig.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to say a few words about the cooperative metadata team, what we're calling the COMET team, which is primarily sort of focused on sort of technical services behind the scenes type work, but has definite implications and potential for impacting our reference services. So the COMET team has representation from University of South Carolina libraries, including Thomas Cooper Library, our Digital Research Services and Collections, the Urban Department of Rare Books and Special Collections, Moving Image Research Collections, South Carolina Political Collections, and the South Carolina Library. Stakeholders include the A.C. Moore Herbarium, the Institute for Southern Studies, the Center for Civil Rights History and Research, McKissick Museum, and the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology. So trying to bring in people from across the U of SC Columbia campus. In the fall of 2021, we received our charge to consider fundamental questions around diversity, representation, equity, access, and justice in describing materials, to advise on schemas, ontologies, standards, and thesauri, to develop policies and best practices for metadata creation, and to facilitate cross-departmental discussion and collaboration, consulting with other stakeholders as needed. So I'll say a few words on our activities to date. Team members have shared relevant articles, blog postings, and other shareable resources amongst themselves. We've compiled a list of controlled vocabularies currently being used across departments, and we've conducted a survey to set priorities and gauge the preferred level of involvement among internal and external stakeholders. Go ahead and advance that slide, Graham, please. Well, I'll just keep talking. So based on survey responses, we have identified as our top priorities developing policies and best practices for metadata creation, and identifying and replacing obsolete and offensive language in descriptive metadata. At this point, I'm going to ask the question, Why are we having these conversations? Why do we have a comment team? And I'm going to take us back to library school for just a minute here. So it's a long way of making a. I'm going to take us in a long way of making a fairly basic point, but just bear with me. So Brian has said a good bit about resources held by the Caroliniana and the different ways we've cataloged them. I'm just going to throw out some basic points. In trying to capture the what is-itness of a resource, we are interested in identifying who, what, where, and when. This is as true for creating finding aids, archiving audiovisual materials as it is for working with bibliographic records. And cultural heritage institutions don't invent search terms. This may surprise non-librarians, non-archivist types, but whether we're describing concepts or demographic groups, material objects, specimens of plants or fungi, we're working from lists of controlled terms. So the McKissick Museum, for example, uses nomenclature for museum cataloging. The A.C. Moore Herbarium uses the International Plant Name Index, Integrated Taxonomic Information System, and USDA Plants Database. And academic libraries, including archives and special collections, use a variety of controlled vocabularies to capture the attributes and intellectual content of digital and physical objects. Chiefly, we use Library of Congress subject headings. Why do we use controlled vocabulary terms? To enable efficient and accurate search results by correlating concepts to authorized headings. We use controlled vocabulary terms to eliminate free text searching problems like variant spellings, synonyms, homophones, and words with the same spelling but different meanings. We use controlled vocabulary terms to facilitate searching across multilingual collections and for searching non-text-based resources like musical scores and visual images. There are potential pitfalls in using controlled vocabulary terms. We may sometimes be relying on headings, including terms that aren't commonly used or understood. A famous sort of old example is how Library of Congress, the subject heading for cookbooks for decades was cookery, not cooking. It was a big deal when they changed that because I don't know that anybody looks for cookbooks using the term cookery. Sometimes headings can conflate multiple ideas. So for example, the Library of Congress subject heading, people with mental disabilities, it's unclear exactly who's being referred to because that could be a reference to folks with intellectual disabilities, defined as limitations in intellectual functioning or adaptive behavior, or could be referring to persons with developmental disabilities, which can encompass in physical or intellectual impairments. And finally, and this is really what the comment team's focus, is that headings may include outdated or offensive terminology. For example, the heading primitive societies is a reference to non-industrialized societies, or the headings aliens and illegal aliens, which it was the subject of a documentary called Change the Subject, and the Library of Congress has in fact recently replaced those terms with less loaded terms, non-citizens and illegal immigration. So these are the kinds of things we're looking at. And to clarify, we are not altering titles or words on the page. Our problematic past is what it is, but we can be doing a better job of contextualizing our collections, whether we're talking digital collections, finding aids in archive space, bibliographic records in the library catalog, you name it. So our next steps, the team will be reviewing and updating obsolete and offensive terms in bibliographic records, digital collections metadata, and finding aids. We will be drafting a university libraries guide for creating metadata that will likely contain an educational component for colleagues who work primarily with researchers. We will be exploring options of controlled vocabularies of the list that we've compiled. There are maybe 25 different controlled vocabulary lists in use at U of SC. That's just really a fraction of what's available to us. And the team will be identifying and sharing resources for personnel to refer to in their daily work. Graham, can you advance the slides? There should be one for just final observations.
Try. Working there. Oh, let me see. No.
Should be in like the bottom left corner.
Yeah, I don't know.
Show up.
Sorry, guys.
No, that's okay. Teams have spoiled us.
Yeah. No.
Is it frozen?
I don't think so.
You tried hitting just like escape or Control-Alt-Delete?
That should be it.
Is that it, Craig?
Well, we're getting warmer, Doc. Paraphrase Bugs Bunny. In fact, actually, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Yes. All right. Good. All right. So, as a final observation, we are not working in isolation. Other cultural heritage institutions are having these conversations as well. And I've included the link to a list of statements on bias in library and archives descriptions that's available through cataloginglab.org. And I can drop the link into the chat, or, well, why don't I try to do that? Ta-da. Yes. Okay. But I advise that everybody go and check that out, because there are examples of how cultural heritage institutions, globally speaking, in Canada and Australia, as well as across the United States, have tried to address the issue of problematic, outdated, offensive, potentially offensive language and representations in their descriptive metadata. And so that's where I conclude my remarks, and I hand it over to Graham. Am I handing it over to you or Edward?
Edward's going to go next.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks, Edward.
So, and I am back here actually in Graham's office. There we go. Just so that it takes 2 librarians. How many library degrees does it take to navigate Zoom and a power presentation in Zoom? That is the question today. So I want to take this kind of disparate conversation. Well, actually, first of all, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, hear you just fine.
Loud and clear.
Thank you. Awesome. So I want to kind of take these disparate conversations that we've been having and tie them together from the viewpoint of the user. And you might be saying, why do you have a picture of MC Escher? And that's because when I think we're doing this work in the background and we're trying to make things more clear, sometimes we might have the unintended consequence of making them more confusing to the user. And I'm not trying to say that like the work that we're doing isn't good. It's really good work. It just takes a lot of education on the front end of the house, on the sort of those of us who are working with patrons every day to work through the different generations of catalog records and cataloging standards and the types of cataloging that has happened. So for instance, I like to think of, if you think back to a card catalog set, and so you have, it's pretty simple. There's a title and an author and maybe 1 or 2 subject headings, and it's very simple. It's almost like a really easy treasure map, because you pull up the card, it tells you where to go to find the pot of gold, and it's just, there's one little line, there's the call number, and there might be a little side quest, if you will, to go find another tasty bit of information, or a different book that might help. But it's a very simple, interactive experience for the user working with, say, a card catalog card. just because, you know, there's sort of one destination that they have, and that is the book that they're looking for, which hopefully, you know, sometimes it leads to more things, sometimes not. But the more complexity we add to successive generations of the catalog adds a bit more paths, if you will, to the search for the treasure or the information that our patrons are looking for. And it not only successive generations of the catalog, but the capabilities of the catalog, such as additional linked data, or the valuable work that Brian and Craig do in, say, adding some of those, you know, other 544 fields, other institutions where materials are held. You know, I think sometimes the patron can be a little overwhelmed by just the amount of data in a catalog record. You know, we look at, it's very easy nowadays to look at kind of successive generations of a catalog record, one that might describe a very complex collection that has very limited information in it. You can look at that and say, well, that goes back to a point in time when we were limited to how many characters we could use in a given field in the catalog record. And that can almost be a good thing because there's not quite as much information for the patron to look through. On the other hand, you know, a much more fleshed out, a really long, there's almost an essay in the description of, say, an archival record. I think patrons, we're doing this work to help them find out information and to show the information that are in archival and special collections records, but it also can be a little overwhelming. And so on the front end of the house, we're almost like a guide working, you know, we're accompanying the patron through a bit of an MC Escher-esque construction. And, you know, we have to warn them that they're going to see things sometimes, you know, for instance, old terms in the catalog, these are going to be a bit grotesque from what we see nowadays. And if you really look at an Escher painting, I mean, it's pretty crazy. And there's going to be things that we don't understand that challenge who we are. You know, gravity is being challenged all the times in these things. And that's really, you know, we have to be prepared to guide patrons through the catalog in a conversation, in a discussion, where we're warning them sometimes saying, you know, these are the kind of terms that you're going to have to look for. We recognize that they're not okay now, they're not correct or politically correct now, but this is how it was done a while ago, you know, like, but also make sure that we're letting folks know that we are changing terms and updating the narrative. And so it's not just different generations, but it's different cataloging standards that those of us who work with the public and who want to connect users to collections, we have to guide folks in that. And it's not just a simple treasure map. It's this convoluted, there's going to be a number of different paths. You know, sometimes, and a great example of this is the Francis Lieber papers. And so there's a set of Francis Lieber papers here at the University of South Carolina. There's also a set of Francis Lieber papers at the Huntington Library in California, which can lead to some confusion. It's great that we have linked that information in the catalog record and say, you know, go here. But that's also something where when you work with the collection and work with the public enough, you get to know the times when you need to say, okay, you're referencing the other one, or we need to approach this question a little bit differently. And that's really being very informed about technical services and cataloging standards and how they're changing is a really important part of working with the public and sort of demystifying and helping folks navigate it. So that's why we're going to move from there. But then the next goal that we have, once we have worked through the catalog to kind of find potential treasures, is simplifying access. And I like to think that access and outreach, I put them both on the same slide just because they go hand in hand. They have very similar goals and they have very similar paths to meeting those goals. And so, and this.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. We're just not seeing the slides that you're talking about. I see them down below, but I just don't want, I know you're talking about a lot of wonderful things, and if you have visuals to go along with those.
What if we turn off his screen share and then turn it back on? I feel like turning stuff off and turning it on always works.
I'm not sure. I mean, you're in, if you click slideshow.
Okay, now I see it.
Yeah. There we go. I was like, because I noticed the Escher
yeah
from before, and I'm like, wait, why is it not up? Okay, thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Edward.
So it's on access and outreach now?
Yep.
Awesome. Awesome. Yep, Graham and I are just sort of scratching our heads because it's really not great. So we have finally worked through and helped a patron have conversations about these different topics and how we can how we're trying to make our catalog more accessible, and then once we are able to do that and help them sort of get to the end of their treasure map, we can we want to simplify the ease of access to collections. And so at the Caroliniana Library, what we've done, especially in response to COVID, is we do a lot more digitization. And I'm not talking about the really high DPI, archival quality scans digitization. What we're doing is a lot of research scans, reference scans, where we're actually using the thing in the top right corner is a Zeuschel Zeta. And that'll just, basically as quick as you can hit the button, you could scan something, make a scan. So like a 300-page book, if it's in appropriate condition and not fragile, the spine opens nicely, the gutter's not too deep, we could digitize something like that in 15 or 20 minutes, which when you think about the logistics that go in behind a patron visit, it's almost easier on our end to scan the whole book for someone and mail it to them rather than continually man a reference desk, make sure the doors are open, go through the logistics of a patron visit. And so we've entirely changed our model for pricing of scans to be, we give an hour of time for free. We kind of figure that if you're going to come in and visit us, it's going to take an hour of our day anyway. And so, we give an hour of scanning for free, and then we do a charge. And this also means that a lot of the folks who are interested and who are doing research, say into some genealogy or minority groups that might be more interested in learning about their heritage, where these materials were previously inaccessible, or groups who might have come through South Carolina previously and then migrated west in family groups. So say African American genealogy, a lot of African Americans have connections to South Carolina due to it having been a slave state, although these folks might now live in Mississippi or Alabama or Texas, having been taken there, kind of close in the antebellum period. And so we're able to really open up resources at, increasing our workflows, but also without any extra output on our effort, really. We've just changed the access model. So we're trying to meet the needs of the research patrons on their own terms. So if they can sit at home in their pajamas and look at a book, that seems great to me. We're also trying to be really compromising with our time in terms of having flexible hours. So, if somebody can only come at 9, that's fine. We'll have them come at 9. We'll stay till 5 if need be. But then what we're also doing is streamlining our workflows. And so we're looking at areas where maybe we weren't running as efficiently as before. We realize that some processes might be taking a little longer just because, we've always done it that way. And so really taking a hard look at some of the things that, take up a lot of time. We're trying to give time back to ourselves by streamlining our workflows. And that allows us to meet even more patrons' needs. And outreach, which is the sort of goes hand in hand with access. And I realize we are running out of time, so I'm going to go real quick. The goal of outreach is to increase public awareness. And that just leads to having more users. And so, by attending community events, especially community events hosted by traditionally groups that are not represented in the archive, this allows us to meet current and also hopefully future patrons. And then we also are trying to create and host special occasions of our own, and then promoting collections whenever possible. And I just say toot your own horn. I think as a lot of times in the archival world, we're very focused on what we do here in the building or the collections we work with. And we're not necessarily as outgoing, maybe, or as sort of spreading the gospel of the archive, if you will, just trying to get out there. And I didn't want to say social media because who knows what the next big thing could be. I think if we try and trace the social media app or try and just, keep up with the latest app, you'll drive yourself crazy. First it's Twitter, and then it's Livestream, and then it's TikTok. I don't even know what they are. And I think students, especially at USC, they use sort of an underground one, Yik Yak, that none of us are on. So it's like, however you can to promote collections is really important.
Thank you, slide. One more. All right, I think we'll stop it there. If by any chance it on the Q&A, thanks for joining this slide.
Yes, it is.
Hey, how about that? All right, so we've got a few, sorry about that. 2 screens and 2 PowerPoint presentations. And
No, that was great. That was a lot of technical information for the non-cataloger brain that I possess. I definitely learned a lot. But I guess, in terms of like, I guess your day to day, it seems that things are constantly changing, right? As subject terms change and processes change. I mean, do you guys kind of, is that not really a question, it's more of just a thought rather. Is there a lot of, every day, are you hitting the ground running with, providing access and changing your cataloging fields and things like that?
I'll let some of the other folks talk about it, but yeah, I mean, I think for sure, I mean, the work Craig's doing with the comment team, I mean, to kind of to rethink kind of where we're at cataloging right now, and then kind of the really creative original cataloging Brian's doing for manuscript collections and the descriptive terms that he's able to use in there. Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's something that's an everyday kind of work for them, and then the constant conversations I think that they're having with folks like Edward who works in public services to make sure that we're describing things in a way that patrons can find them and find useful. But since I don't work on any of those things, I'll let some of them talk if they want to about that.
I guess another question I had too is like with these changes that you're making, I know that there's definitely some standardizations that you follow, but are you consulting anyone in your like direct community that you serve to, make sure that what you're updating is, accurate, anything like that, any consulting, locally?
Craig, do you want to talk about just a little bit about the way kind of, I mean, maybe the community input on changing descriptive terms as works at all?
Well, again, that's why it's a team. So this is not a hierarchical structure in the sense that we're going to be making top-down decisions. We're sort of in an investigation mode, and which will involve sort of looking at how other institutions have navigated these kinds of issues, and have they chosen to use other controlled vocabulary lists to work around some of the limitations of, say, Library of Congress subject headings. I mean, that's just part of it. But yeah, I mean, there's a reason it's not just simply librarians or simply archivists, but we're trying to pull in the folks at the Institute for Archaeology and Anthropology and McKissick Museum and the AC Moore Herbarium, who work primarily with material culture objects, or in the case of the herbarium with specimens, so that we're not we're not reinventing the wheel, and that we're not kind of making recommendations in isolation, that there are these sort of avenues for input across the Columbia campus. Aaron, I don't know if that really answers your question.
I was thinking kind of in the larger kind of just world of folks kind of working with descriptive terminology. I mean, there are some, I don't want to say crowdsourced, but for lack of a better term, kind of ways that community have been involved in ensuring correct descriptive terms are available for folks working with cataloging and that kind of thing to access, maybe not Library of Congress, but other groups that are working on updated search terms.
No, that does answer my question. Thank you.
All right, I know we're up against the break, so.
Yeah, there were no other questions that came in. Erica did leave a comment to say, check out olacharleston.com.
Cool.
Yeah, that's the only thing that has come up so far, though.
All right.
Yeah, I don't want to cut into the break. I mean, I've got a couple questions, but I think that we should probably take 5. What do you think, Aaron?
Oh, that's okay with me. Oh, Erica had mentioned that was in reference to the Spanish language archiving.
Yeah,
Okay.
when Brian was talking about archiving the different Spanish language
Gotcha.
publications
Okay.
during the presentation. Yeah, that was
Okay.
interesting. That.
I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. Yeah, I'm cool if people want to take 5. Sounds good to me. I'll step away.
Okay, well, thank y'all so much for everything. I think we can ask a few questions when we come back if we want, just if y'all are still going to be participating. Craig and Brian and
I'll be here.
Raymond. Okay. All right. We'll meet back at 11. All right. I think we've got just about everybody back. Before we move on to Meg's presentation, I want to take a couple minutes and ask a few questions of each of the presenters, because I know that was a lot of information and it probably could have been individual presentations, but they were worried about filling up the time. And I think, as we see, they had plenty of things to share. But Meg, I just want to give you the disclaimer that we are not cutting into your time. We were originally supposed to run until 1 and had a presenter back out at the last minute. So once you start, you've got your full 50 minutes and don't worry about it. Okay, but I just wanted to ask a question of each of the presenters. So first off, Brian, are you there? Is he still in the chat?
He may have stepped away from his desk.
Okay, well then I'll skip Brian for now. Okay, so Craig, could you talk a little bit about the way, I know that we have a lot of non-technical services minds, and one of the reasons that I wanted to include you and Brian particularly on this was to talk about the way that technical services play into public services and how public services can only be so helpful if you don't have all of the metadata and the cataloging behind it so that you can find the information. So can you talk a little bit about why it's so important to catalog? I mean, I know that's a very general question, but it's not, everybody kind of chalks it up to, oh, cataloging's the technical part and the part that nobody wants to talk about, but like why it's so important, because I know that one of the big questions you get when you're cataloging and you describe what you do to people, I'm sure you get it, is, oh, so you're digitizing. But just how cataloging is a foundational aspect of access. Does that make sense?
Sure.
It's not a direct question, but
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yeah. I think that in simplest terms, it's kind of, when working with archival materials or special collections materials, they're it's not like quite working with a commercial publication where there's a clear author, a clear title, obvious physical extent, things like that, obvious subject matter. When working with archival collections, if we're not sort of kind of trying to capture the what is-itness, the who, what, where, when, why of a collection, then it's just that much harder for a researcher to find what they're looking for. So if we received a ledger from a 19th century dry goods store based in Allendale County, and the extent of the description was 1 volume, 1832, 1852, and that was it. That's all we provided. Well, that is sort of what it is, but that's not terribly helpful. You know, what do users need to know? Well, who? Well, it was this, this dry goods store called, Allen and Company. What is it? It's an account book. When? 1832 to 1850. Where? They were based in Allendale County. And so that's kind of what cataloging is, especially with rare materials. This is what we're doing, is giving people these access points so that they can do more granular searches. So that's probably still too jargony, but
no, absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about, I know some certain materials of interest that open up genealogy in ways that people don't expect. So like, I'm just thinking particularly about things like estate sales or bills of sale, or things that have specific names on them that you personally, when you're creating an original record, can provide access to someone who would not necessarily know to use that resource, that you wouldn't necessarily find in the census on ancestry.com. Or how are you providing access points to underrepresented people, not just in the, we are looking for them, but we're finding them within the materials that we already have by describing them more fully.
I'm back on now, so I did hear this question. I didn't hear the first part. Yeah, that is something that I always include because that is one of the places that enslaved people would, are going to show up in a will. And also, account books, you might have people listed on family, often have them with family groupings, family units, that sort of thing. Something that I cut out of this talk, but it was, if you get a reference question from someone, that lives in Minnesota or Missouri or something, and they're getting ready for the family reunion and they're looking up, they want to do some African-American genealogy, and they say, oh, I'm not going to have much time to visit, but there's so many people that use the records of antebellum Southern plantations microfilm set that's really handy. There's plenty of times back when I was working the desk and would take a phone call from upstate New York or something, and they were looking for a collection and they'd say, oh, I see that this is at this university that's close by you, so you could look this, you could find those papers. People were less averse to microfilm back then. And there's also an index. There was a woman who was a reference librarian, I think cataloger also at UVA, who'd written a book, Index to the Records of Antebellum Southern Plantations. And she had, so it's like 400-page book. I think it came out in 2003. And she cross-referenced both which microfilm set is held by which university, and the names of the plantations, the names of the counties, and the names of the plantation owners. And so it's so handy because you had people like Richard Manning and Wade Hampton. Their lavish lifestyle in South Carolina was supported by property they owned in the proceeds of what was going on in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. And so there's going to be materials related to South Carolina families in those deeper South states. And that's that index that she put together ties that together. So I mean, it's good for people doing, when you're writing your dissertation or you're doing family history. That's something, and it's great when you can, like with a long distance email, phone call, you can say, oh, you don't have to make a trip. This is close by you. Saves them a trip.
I also had a question for you, Brian. You were talking about all the different resources that you follow as a collector and donor, in addition to describing materials.
Yes.
What would you say, I mean, how do you discern what you're going to follow? I mean, there's so much information that exists and it's so hard, to manage your time anyway. What dictates what you're focusing on? Do you just follow a bunch of news outlets and, go to all the local events and sign up for all the listservs, or what's your, I guess, method of digesting information?
Of digesting information for collection development?
Yes.
Okay. Well, like Free Times used to have a column that was about local authors. And so that's been gone a long, long time, but I would always make a email a note to myself, book we do not have. And there's, some of those things they'll show up, it's going to cross my path. And I'm not, if there's a yard sale between me and whatever errands I'm running on Saturday, I'll stop and look. Richmond RCPL's book sales used to be several times a year. Those were always great because there would be a lot of historical biographical material, yearbooks, that kind of thing there. So it kind of varies in talking to people. What we have such interesting jobs doing, working here, and so chatting people up and what do you do, and I tell them, and then if they say they're emptying their grandmother's house or their parents' house or something, that's another thing that I make a case we can provide a safe perpetual home if you have family letters from Vietnam or that kind of thing. So it's just kind of keeping my eyes open on new books coming out. When there's a thrift shop, I'll browse just to see if there's one of these memoirs or something. There's a estate sale. I don't go out of my way. I don't look them up and go out of my way. But if there's one that's I notice, I'll stop at those. piles by the side of the road, and you can tell some old person who's lived in that house for 50 years died. I found so many things for free that way. And again, I'm just amazed at how many things are not held binding at the library at some of these things that I found.
In that, along with that, I guess I have a question for Graham. How do you discern, Graham, are you there? Just want to make sure. I don't want to ask him if he's on break.
Yeah, I'm here.
How do you discern what to keep and what not to keep, especially with the new awareness that we are creating so much information and we need to keep it? And there are projects like Erica was talking about earlier. I mean, that was, within the last decade. When you're working for a library that is focusing on a state that has such a rich history, how do you discern what to keep and what not to keep?
Yeah,
it would be easy to keep everything, but it would also be easy. There's also been a long tradition, not necessarily in the Carolina, but just throughout archives, that it needs to be important. It needs to be from a donor, and figuring out what important means. So just general accession. How do you determine your collection scope?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, it's a good question. I was going to talk a little bit about this before, so I'm glad you asked. I mean, I think first and foremost, you have to kind of think about both your own institution and the larger institution's mission, and how exactly these materials are going to be able to fit into that mission, and whether it's serving, kind of a student population, faculty population, or your outside research population. I mean, we're very careful now in ways that we may not have been in the past to not accept duplicate material really at all. It's just a drain on both staff time and resources and space. Beyond that, though, I think given limited space and given limited kind of staff time and resources, that we're in the process of putting together a new collection policy, really, and we want to really focus on ideas of reparative collecting strategies. So, keeping in the forefront of our mind that kind of maybe in the past, collecting efforts at places like the Carolina and other Southern repositories have kind of really prioritized documenting members of the white power structure, and that's really resulted in some significant gaps. So I think that we have to, going forward, prioritize the resources that we have to acquire and describe historically under collected communities and underrepresented communities within our archive, and at the same time recognizing that there's work to be done with those communities in terms of building trust, and it may be either a long road or a road that means that community would rather undertake that work themselves, and supporting them where we can. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's so much stuff out there, and given unlimited resources, we'd like to collect it all. But I mean, that's not the situation we find ourselves in. So I think you have to set kind of priorities, and it has to come through your organizational mission, and then where you can, to try to undo some of the I don't want to say mistakes, but some of the kind of legacies of the past.
Right. Well, thank y'all so much. That was wonderful, and this has been very informative, and I wish that we had a little bit more time, but maybe in the future. Erin, are you there?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
I think we're ready to move on to Meg if she's ready.
Sure. Let me just bring my slides up, and
thank you so much, everyone from South Carolina.
Thank you.
That was a lot of new, interesting ways to look at archival advocacy, and not just through public programming.
Let me just,
all right, Erin, you can take over.
Sure. Let me just get my slides up. And Meg, did you want me to control your slides, or
I'll attempt to control my slides.
Okay, no problem. So let me just give your introduction here, and then I will stop sharing and then let you take over. So for our final presentation today, we have Megilliard, who is an archaeologist. Meg is an archaeologist with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, SCDNR, Heritage Trust Program. She's also the co-founder of the South Carolina Archaeology Public Outreach Division, SCAA pod, as well as being the co-founder of the North American Heritage at-Risk Research Collective. Her primary research is in archaeology, visual anthropology, public interpretation, disaster preparedness and recovery, and heritage at risk. Meg received an MA in visual anthropology from the University of Manchester, where she focused her research on the visual representation of archaeology, and BA degrees in journalism and anthropology from the University of South Carolina. So I will let Meg take it over, and we're really happy to have you here today.
Thanks, Shaw. Let's see if I can share my screen.
Also, once again, Meg, don't feel limited by the time constraint, because originally we had this slotted to go till 1. So take your time presenting, and we'll take time answering questions after. And just don't rush through it.
Okay. All right.
It's nice how we've had a blend of, the themes of today. There's archaeology and community.
Absolutely.
Activism. It's tying in nicely.
Is it showing my notes slide, or is it showing the full screen?
It's not full screen.
Full screen? Okay.
No, it's not.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
Yeah, it's showing the notes.
Let's see. I also use Teams more frequently.
We'll make a note for next time.
It's all good. Let's see if let's see if it'll share that screen. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let's see if it'll actually let me control now. Okay. Oh, technology. So good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Meg, and I'm an archaeologist with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources Heritage Trust Program. And thanks again so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation of advocacy and outreach with archives. I know archaeology is kind of a different subject, but there is a blend. So the title of my presentation today, While I Breathe, I hope, of course, I'm sure you all know, is that one of South Carolina's 2 state mottos. The second motto of the state is prepared in mind and resources. And so when I think of advocacy and archives and disaster preparedness and recovery, these 2 mottos together give me a sense of resilience and determination and strength in the face of disasters. And together they encapsulate the ethos needed to prepare and recover from the disasters we face. In the context of the research that I do as an archaeologist at the Department of Natural Resources, in the context of disaster preparedness and recovery, the broad category of cultural studies, which encompasses everything we all do in archaeology, archives, libraries, museums, it tends to be forgotten by the greater disaster recovery world when they are planning for disasters and including people at the table. Sometimes we are not included. People that deal with economics and transportation and environmental are always thought of. Living communities, of course, are always considered. But the cultural components of our state and the country as a whole are sometimes forgotten. And so when I talk about advocacy in archaeology and cultural studies, I give the example of the flood of 2015 and what our team went through and the kind of steps forward we've taken in the last few years to be more inclusive and to make sure that we as cultural researchers and the people that we advocate for have a seat at that table. So let's get started with my slides, and I won't rush through, I promise, but I'll leave time at the end for questions. So the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources Cultural Heritage Trust team has a staff currently of 20 archaeologists and property managers who directly manage 18 cultural heritage trust properties across our state that total about 4,000 acres of land. And while these properties and the cultural collections that we curate from these properties are our primary focus, our team also provides cultural resource services to the agency across the 1.1 million acres that we own and manage from the mountains to the barrier islands. So that's quite a bit of history there. At the time of the 2015 flood, our staff numbered 3, and our offices were at the SCD&R headquarters on the State House grounds in Columbia, South Carolina. Represented here on our law enforcement map is Region 3B. Due to the limited space that we had at our headquarters, all of our archives, our paper documents, our books, our photographs, our artifacts were all stored at various locations around the state, including the home office of a colleague and contractor also located in Region 3B. The 2015 flood seems like a distant nightmare, especially with the increasing rate of natural disasters to hit the southeastern United States. And these disasters have catastrophic impacts on archaeological sites, historic structures, museums, libraries, archives, curation facilities, as well as living communities and their traditional cultural properties. For our team, the flood of 2015 provided a catalyst for the development of a more robust disaster plan and led to the acquisition of our first research center in Columbia called Parker Annex Archaeology Center in April 2017. It also propelled us to develop a stronger network of support to assist not only our colleagues in the cultural realm, but to assist others and private community members in times of disaster. So I want to take a moment to review what formed the flood of 2015 that impacted South Carolina, what the overall impacts were, and to provide you with a case study of our recovery efforts in hopes that it might prepare you and your staff for recovery in the future and those that you serve in your community. As September 2015 drew to a close, a nearly stationary frontal boundary set up camp over coastal South Carolina, drenching the state for days on end. By October the 1st, the National Weather Service began issuing warnings that a historic and potentially life-threatening rainfall event was expected during the weekend. Low pressure formed on a stationary front hugging the coast, while strong high pressure built to the north, according to our state climatologist and my colleague, Dr. Hope Mizell. This pattern resulted in a strong flow of tropical moisture off the warm Atlantic waters, increasing rainfall intensity over the already saturated state. And to complicate the forecast, Hurricane Joaquin had re-intensified to a Category 4 storm over the Bahamas. The arrangement of atmospheric features, which included an upper level area of low pressure near the Alabama-Georgia border and high pressure to the north, and a distant Hurricane Joaquin created a river of air that was condensed into historic rains. During the 2015 flood event, 158 DNR officers were deployed across 11 South Carolina counties and conducted 930 rescues and assists, putting in 12,000 man hours. There were more than 1,500 total rescues and assists during the flood. 50 dams breached or completely failed. 541 roads and bridges were closed. 20,000 people were displaced. 36 of the 46 South Carolina counties were declared disaster areas. 19 people lost their lives, and there was a total of $2.2 billion in damages across our state. My agency's division, the Land, Water, and Conservation Division, of which our archaeology team is a part, houses the State Climate Office, the flood mitigation programs, and other teams of researchers. And our team of cultural resource managers is in a unique position to work with people at the forefront of disaster preparedness and recovery within our state. As you'll see in a few minutes, we were very lucky to have the resources we did, the network we already had in place during our disaster recovery efforts. And I keep that in mind every time I talk about what we went through, because if we had had a different budget, limited supplies, no volunteers, no support network of colleagues, including archivists, curators, and librarians, we would have found ourselves in a very different disaster recovery process. This is what I saw on my living room television Monday, October the 5th, 2015, before we could reach our archives. I started preparing a specific recovery plan at home based on information I had received in a disaster preparedness workshop years before, prior to traveling to the archives to begin recovery efforts on Wednesday, October the 7th. The home office in which our archives were stored was farther down this road at a lower elevation, and we had to enter the property from the road above Timberlane Drive and walk through other properties to gain access to the office. At this point, when I provide this talk and this case study to my students and interns who have not typically experienced a disaster in their young life yet, I review multiple things, including the Incident Command System, or ICS, recommendations for medical protocols in times of disaster, the fact that they should never go around road barriers, the stressful reality that supplies can be delayed or stopped for days or weeks coming into a disaster area, the fact that if they are working with a public institution, that they need to have somebody designated to speak with the media potentially. And then all the important points of having up-to-date disaster recovery plans, disaster recovery kits, and ways to document and recover from disasters, especially when seeking reimbursement from FEMA. And this is an image of the front of our facility. The water is covering the roadway, and the water actually went over that vehicle. This photograph depicts approximately 15% of the total archive recovered after the flood. Paper records, photographs, negatives, and slides were our priority because of how quickly they will mold, but also loan collections. This is always your obligation as a temporary custodian of loan collections to inform the owner of the collections having been impacted and recover those objects before your own. The restoration of these objects should be according to the owner's wishes, or the institution's wishes rather, as described in a loan agreement, and perhaps with a disaster recovery company that you have on contract. And we especially think that this is important with local community members who might donate a book or a record or a letter or an artifact to an institution for study or for display. It's also important to note here that those who are emotionally attached to collections and cannot make effective decisions should be asked to step away for a time. And they might not be able to return to assist, and that's okay. Perhaps they can assist and offer advice over the phone or Zoom if they have institutional knowledge. And these individuals can also assist by gathering supplies in the local community. And I mention this because in our field of cultural studies in general, archaeology or archives, librarians, our whole working lives are centered around the protection and preservation of objects. And certain collections can actually represent somebody's working life. And we have to understand that that will take an emotional toll, not only on the researchers, but potentially the community as a whole. Since we did not have a disaster recovery contract in place at the time of the 2015 flood, we purchased 5 freezers and froze approximately 100 cubic feet of documents. So I ask most people when I give this presentation to consider what their institutional's digital archive situation is like and their accessibility online. All modern paper documents that we held, such as field notes from archaeological excavations, maps, and so forth, were also stored electronically. And so in these situations, if paper documents were damaged during a disaster in the future, we can make an executive decision to reduce our disaster recovery costs by discarding damaged paper documents and relying on the digital archive potentially from some of these places. We also ask in these situations if you know which documents within your archive are considered the most important, which might need to be protected and gathered first prior to others. Following the assessment and hopefully stabilization of the most fragile and time-sensitive items in your archive, such as paper and loaned collections, a determination needs to be made, as in the case of what we had to go through, if we could recover things in place or if we needed to acquire another long-term facility for long-term recovery efforts. Old schools and civic centers within your community are ideal to provide a space for long-term recovery efforts. And this is exactly what we did in acquiring an old fine arts center in the county of Lexington. Right now, prior to a disaster, think about scoping out possible recovery locations. The space you will need will need to be well ventilated, have heat and AC, water, electricity, restrooms, and security. You will also need to establish use agreements with government agencies or owners of the facilities you anticipate using in the future. So during our recovery efforts, following the freezing of documents to stop the mold process, we quickly focused our attention on the drying of approximately 15,000 photographs, negatives, and slides that were in our archive. I made the decision to hang the photographs to dry rather than laying them flat so that we could dry approximately 3,000 photographs per day over the course of a week. All images were scanned during the summer of 2016 for digital storage on the DNR servers. And these are just images of photographs from archaeological excavations. As many of you all know, when we excavate archaeological sites, it's a destructive science, and basically in the process of gathering data about histories of people from our past in South Carolina, we actually destroy that context. So the photographs, the artifacts, the notes are all important to tell that history of thousands of years of people's history. This is a view from a top stage of all those images being dried. Artifacts were our next priority and took the most time to recover following the paper documents and photographs. Approximately 8 months with the assistance of 8 paid staffers, in addition to our standard crew of archaeologists, and 135 volunteers. So that community outreach was ever important. Floodwaters filled most of the artifact bags. And remember that water equals weight. So draining as much of this water as possible before moving to a long-term recovery facility was absolutely imperative. Within the collection, the plan and arrangement for taking care of the loaned collections and possibly moving those collections back to their original facility is all important. Because artifacts in the 2015 flood floated for 3 days, archival boxes were completely saturated. And we did have to call in assistance from those in other states, and including these 2 archivists from Georgia, to come and help us with some loaned collections and special collections. I'm going to pop this number on the screen right now. I'm sure that most of you all are familiar with this, but the National Heritage Responders Network, a 24/7 line. If you need help in times of disaster, it could be a burst water pipe or a hurricane. It really doesn't matter. After draining as much flood water from the artifact bags as possible, all artifact bags were placed in sandbags. And this is that process taking place. This is Dr. Jody Barnes, who was our State Historic Preservation archaeologist, sorting through the damaged bags and putting them into categories of collections pertaining to archaeological sites. These are the sandbags that most of those artifact bags went into for safekeeping. 1 box to 1 bag when possible. So the standard archival boxes were just completely falling apart. So 1 box of artifacts went into 1 sandbag. Identification tags were placed in the sandbags, and on the top of the artifacts, the key identifying information was written on flagging tape to tie around the exterior of the sandbags. Moving artifacts from boxes that were falling apart to sandbags made it safer for transport and easier storage during long-term recovery efforts over the course of those 8 months. Artifacts impacted by the flood were already curated and had been for quite some time, some for 20 years or more, but all bags, tags, and boxes that were in the floodwaters had to be discarded and replaced. And all artifacts had to be washed again. Every single one was hit with floodwaters due to the pressure of the water filling into the bags that were even closed. Original tags, bags, and other identifying information were saved during the drying process on racks and under each drying artifact below the cardboard fry baskets that we use to separate the dirty from the clean. Old tags, bags, and other identifying information were thrown out once the artifacts were recurated with fresh tags and bags. We also teach about to our interns and students and those who haven't experienced disasters to consider how much garbage you'll produce in the process of recovery. Asking if you have a truck or trailer to dispose of garbage, and if the county you're working within has a designated disposal area for disaster materials that will count towards FEMA reimbursement. Once collections are processed, we recommend keeping them separate from those still going through the recovery process. All recurated collections went on a top stage in the Fine Arts Center that we were using for the flood recovery efforts. This space was visually and physically separate from the collections still needing work, so that both our staff and our volunteers and those coming into the facility would know to basically stay away from these recurated collections and work on what was at a lower elevation. While we had a dedicated staff working 40 hours per week for 8 months straight, we also had the help of 135 volunteers during the recovery process, and they were imperative to us actually finishing this work. These are volunteers from the Veterans Curation Program in Augusta, Georgia. And while there's much to say about managing volunteers and advertising volunteer networks in your community through social media, the most important thing to remember as a cultural resource manager in times of disaster is to document all volunteer names and times worked, so that your institution can report that information to FEMA for reimbursement. Volunteer time in our case counted towards a 25% match to FEMA for FEMA to give us a 75% reimbursement for our recovery expenses. Another thing to remember is that sometimes reimbursement in the case of disaster, not only with an institution, but for a community, can take quite a while. So in our case, even as a state government agency, it took 10 months post-flood for a 75% reimbursement of our expenses to be deposited into our accounts from FEMA. And I always ask the question, especially speaking with smaller institutions, maybe a museum or a curation facility that has one staffer, a small museum that has one volunteer staffer, asking what a delayed reimbursement of funds would do to that institution's accounts, future budgets, plans, and staff salaries. At the end of August 2016, our agency entered into a lease agreement with the South Carolina State Museum for 1 year as we looked for new facilities to house our collections, laboratories, and offices. In April 2017, our team moved into Parker Annex, an old South Carolina State Hospital property, and we renamed the building Parker Annex Archaeology Center. This building contains offices for our staff and interns, labs that seat 24, teaching space, conference space, and permanent curation space. And these are images of us moving from the South Carolina State Museum with our clean collections to our long-term facility once we were able to install rolling stacks into our facility, in our laboratory, and then outside gate that goes into Parker Annex. Parker Annex's history, it was built in 1910. It was an African-American male ward on the Bull Street property on the mental health hospital. And it was in the back corner of the property. And from 1910 to 1926, it was the dormitory for African-American men. And from 1926 to the 1970s, it served as the Caucasian male tuberculosis ward. Prior to its construction, this corner of the property was actually the prisoner of war camp for Union officers during the Civil War. And the property also has a history of taking in refugees following the burning of Columbia during the Civil War. And this was what kind of attracted us to this facility because of the history of its story, the history of the city of Columbia and our state that we could tell through being in this building and being part of the community. So following the flood of 2015, I started to increase my network of disaster preparedness and recovery contacts and assist others at every opportunity, not only my colleagues, but people within the local community and private citizens. I attended a heritage Emergency and Response Training, or HART training, hosted by the Smithsonian Institute's Cultural Rescue Initiative in December 2019, right before the pandemic began. If any of you all are interested in more disaster recovery training, I would highly recommend applying to HART and looking at their resources that are available. They've paused currently all hands-on disaster recovery training due to the pandemic, but it's a great network to be a part of. The gentleman standing behind me in the fatigues is actually the current commander of the new Monuments Men. So the kind of networking that is available to you through this organization is absolutely immense in what you can bring back to your local community. By the next year, in the summer and fall of 2020, when we were all working from home during the pandemic, I connected with a group of female archaeology colleagues I'd worked with for years across the southeastern United States who work on cultural sites impacted by climate change. We formed a working group we named the North American Heritage at Risk, or NAHAR, Research Collective because of our motivation to develop and deploy a unified and scalable response to the impacts of climate change on our cultural heritage. The NAHAR approach is rooted in a praxis that prioritizes community-based collaboration and resource sharing, informed by scientific modeling and analysis. Each member of NAHAR brings a mosaic of success in the areas of community outreach, predictive modeling for climate change impacts to cultural sites and institutions, and mitigation of damage leading up to and following disasters. As an all-woman team, we hope to make the most effective use of every heritage at risk research tool available in the southeastern US, as well as globally, to address the enormous issues and impacts of cultural resources from climate change at the very time action is most critical. The NAHAR research pipeline has 5 objectives: modeling, monitoring, meeting with local communities, methodizing and mitigating the damages that draw on unique programs that were already underway in the states of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina when NAHAR was established. Moving forward, when we think about planning for future disasters, we have to think about all cultural resources and communities. The cultural sites that are part of the landscape all around us, such as archaeological sites and traditional cultural properties of indigenous communities, the Gullah Geechee Nation, collections within curation facilities, documents and archives and libraries, and living communities that could be impacted. It will be through sharing resources and knowledge, expanding networks and conversations, and offering a helping hand when we can, that we will become more resilient as cultural resource managers now and in the future. Thank you.
That is a very cute dog.
That's Scout.
Aw. No, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Meg. Let me see. I don't see any questions in the chat, but just one thing that comes to mind. Well, one is I need to update my disaster preparedness plan for my own institution, but I guess you definitely have your work cut out for you. Just the other day, I don't know if folks have seen, but the images from like the Outer Banks, like Rodanthe, North Carolina, that home just kind of literally falling into the ocean as a result of high tides and floods. I'll see if I can find the link to the article there. But I mean, Meg, as we prepare for another hurricane season, do you anticipate a lot more work ahead, I guess, as years progress? And I guess, I don't know if there's a lack of understanding of climate change and, amongst lawmakers. I know it's a problem in North Carolina, but does South Carolina have at least a little bit more protection for, I guess in terms of climate change and laws? I'm not really sure if I'm asking the correct questions here.
I think in the context of climate change, we're kind of having more conversations now. And thank goodness they're involving local communities and organizations who need to have a seat at the table. And so there are different organizations such as the South Carolina Office of Resilience that was recently formed last year. Cultural actually didn't have a seat at the table until quite recently. So this kind of like inclusion is really important for our field to make sure that people making the decisions and making the policies know that archives are important, that oral histories are important, the archaeological collections and these sites are important. And they are as important as transportation. We are the caretakers of the history of the state, thousands of years of history of the state and those voices. And so I think that just making sure that we have a seat at the table is incredibly important, so that we are part of the policy, that we are part of the laws, and that what we care about and take care of is protected at a higher level. Our conversations within the Nahar group, and I've put a link in the chat, are actually going globally now. So we have colleagues in Scotland, Australia, all throughout Europe, that we can rely on to have greater conversations and bring in more community advocacy across a global scale. And I've also popped in a link for native lands, so that if you all are interested in not only the tribal communities located in our state that are very active, but the voices of those who have been displaced, such as the Muskogee Nation that are currently in Oklahoma, that have a tie to South Carolina, and their inclusion and their voice in what we protect culturally is also important to put at the table and to put within those policies of advocacy and climate action. I hope that answered your question.
Oh, yes, yes. And I brought up those links. Thank you again for sharing those. Are there any other questions for Meg?
Well, if we don't have any, it's because you did a very thorough and in-depth discussion of your project. That is fascinating.
And I would just encourage everybody, if you are interested in more of these broader conversations with advocacy and community inclusion, when it comes to cultural heritage as a whole, we do record all of our Nahar guest speaker lectures, and they're available on the website to watch. So it's a lot of voices, from archaeologists to archivists to librarians, and we try to be as inclusive as possible and have a broad umbrella of conversations that are ongoing.
How much of your disaster preparedness plan, I mean, I guess this isn't necessarily, it's all the same umbrella, but how much do you rely on having duplicates and having, triplicates through the form of a digitized copy? How much emphasis do you think you put on that, as opposed to the physical originals being, or not as opposed to, but in addition to the originals being stored in a secure environment and going through the checklist of all the things to make your collections as safe as they can be?
In the terms of paper documents?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So one of my colleagues actually does a much better job than I do. He's in Tennessee, and he has 3 digital archives. One is in a different country, one is in a different state, one is at his institution in Tennessee. And then he also has his paper documents physically in curation stacks. That would be the model to follow, I think, but we are not to that point. We do not have collections in a different country digitally stored on servers, but I think just having our collections, we physically have them in those stacks that I showed, in archival boxes downstairs. They are in aisle 1, the fastest and easily accessible aisle. And then we have digital archives in DNR servers that are stored outside of the Parker Annex facility.
How difficult is it to get? It's such an interesting juxtaposition. When we were first recommended you as a speaker, when you think of South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, I mean, at least me personally, I think of, hunting and like certain protections for animals and for nature, and you don't think about the physical archival collections that are associated with all that. How difficult is it to get people in your organization higher up, I guess, to care about, I don't know, I guess the archives, because I feel like a lot of us are a little bit, I mean, in terms of funding, it's hard, but we're in a little bit more of a sound chamber with knowing at least that other people are in the archival field, but it seems like you're in a particularly unique position where you are not with a bunch of people that necessarily recognize the immediate value of donating resources and designating resources to your project.
For sure, yeah. So internal education is always a big thing for our team. The Heritage Trust program at the DNR has been around since 1974. It was the first of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. Our objective legally is to protect and preserve cultural and natural properties that are seen as living museums and living laboratories. And we acquire properties and protect them in perpetuity, as well as the collections they hold, the artifacts they hold, the stories they hold. And so just educating internally the rest of our agency about the importance of these lands is critical, because a lot of them don't know that even an archaeology team exists in this agency of almost 1,000 employees. And then also educating the greater population of our agency about the importance not only of these cultural heritage preserves, which is only 4,000 acres, but the 1.1 million acres across our whole state that our agency manages. Every piece of land has a story, every piece of land has a history, every piece of land has a tie to a tribal group, and an important legacy that needs to be protected and preserved. So those kind of stories is what we kind of are the caretakers of at our agency, on our team, and just kind of internally educating other agency folks who might be in wildlife or fisheries about that history, the complex history, that it's more than just the natural resources. The cultural resources are intricately tied into the history of our state, is critical, especially in the wake of disasters coming left, right, and center. We are losing some of our sites along the coast, specifically in Charleston County. There's one site called the Pocky Island Shell Ring Complex, which is 4,300 years old. And we're losing it at a rate of erosion of 15.5 meters a year. So this cultural site that is, I'm sorry?
Where's that located?
Oh, it's on Edisto Island.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and this particular site is ancestral lands of the Muskogee Nation, and so telling their story before that particular place is wiped off the face of the map. Protecting that collection is critical as part of our legal obligation to the state. So things like that, internal advocacy and conversations, as well as community conversations, is important as we move forward in the wake of protecting the history and stories of the people that came before us.
Well, thank you so much. Aaron, do you have anything else?
Oh, no.
Meg?
No, I don't. I can deliver, the closing comments if there are no other questions.
All right.
All righty. So great job. Thank you. Let me just go ahead and I'll share my screen one more time. All right. So just going to deliver some closing comments here. So thank you again to all of our wonderful presenters. There was a lot of information that was shared with us, and we hope that those who attended today had some really good information and ideas that have come up as a result of our presenters and the information that they've shared about their projects. Again, as well, thank you to the SCAA board for their leadership and support, and also working with us and supporting us to get this workshop planned and coordinated. So again, thank you. And just some information, if for those on the call who are not members of SCAA, we do have the membership link here for you, as well as the link for updated events and activities, as well as how to join the listserv. So those are all the comments that I had. May, if there was anything additionally that you wanted to share, feel free. But if not, we could, and look at us right on with 6 there.
I'm going to share that link to the drive one more time. I think Tabitha changed the permissions so that everyone can view it if they want. But we will also, once this recording has been saved, it will be uploaded with the same PDFs of the slides and of the text from the slides. And we'll get all of the presentations from the presenters to upload to that as well for reference. And it will be available there for anybody who missed it, or if there's anything else you wanted to go back and revisit. But I think that was it. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. This has been a great blend of a lot of different facets of our field. So thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you for taking the time to present. We know that there's a lot of different things happening at everyone's respective jobs. So again, thank you for your time and dedication to this effort. We appreciate you. All right, well, with that, have a wonderful day, everyone.